Hello, my name's Faye and today is the last day of January, and despite it being really grey and grim and drab, I am stubbornly going to do my January reading wrap up and talk about the 7 books that I read this month and whether or not I enjoyed them. And I thought, because it's the first month of the year, we'll just go chronologically. I've got my bullet journal here to help me remember what I read, and the very first book I read, I carried over from the first year, and that was Nnedi Okorafor's Who Fears Death, which I wanted to read for a very long time. I have this really stunning looking edition, and how do I start this? I got into science fiction and fantasy, back into science fiction and fantasy a few years ago, and this one sits somewhere in between science fiction and fantasy. I know that real fans of the genre get quite upset if you mislabel books, but I've seen this one been talked about both as sci-fi and fantasy because it is set in a somewhat alternate Sudan, in a sort of post-apocalyptic setting which is never really fully explained, and we follow our main character, Onye Sonwu, she's called, as she makes her way from her village over to the west of the country to stop a great evil from happening. There is a civil war going on. And we're never really told what has happened, but the sort of sci-fi aspects are really interesting. There are sort of like contraptions that draw water from the skies, which is a smart little solution for having your main characters travel through the desert and not having to deal with all the sort of survivalist problems or tropes within these stories. But then we also have a strong magic system, and that's why I am unsure whether to call it science fiction or fantasy, to be honest, because our main character is the result of her mum being raped, and children who are the product of rape, that sounds horrible, are born looking physically very different. They have a different skin color, their hair has a slightly different texture, and it's very obvious to everyone who sees them. So she's not an outcast, because she tries very hard not to be, but that whole conversation is really interesting. I found it really slow to get into in the beginning, and then towards the end I'm not sure I got everything, to be quite honest. So if you've read this one, let me know. I did attend a book event at a sci-fi and fantasy bookshop a few years ago, where they were discussing the genre of Afrofuturism. So I wonder whether this one could be labelled as such. Interesting read, which I ended up only giving 3 stars because I just found it difficult to get into, and I was very thoroughly confused by the really, really horrific dark themes, trigger warnings for murder, rape. There's a war between 2 peoples going on here. It's all very graphic on the page, and yet our main characters have real teeny problems as well. So there's sort of this YA spin. So that confused me. But I thought it was a really interesting one, so not a disappointed 3 stars. Then I have to read the title off, Josh and Gemma Make a Baby. What a horrible title, by Sarah Reddy, which was a rom-com that I got for free off NetGalley. And I was quite interested to read this one because the trope of pregnancy or accidental pregnancy in romance novels really bugs me. Sort of suggesting that a baby will save a couple, I think, is problematic in many case. But the plot of this one is that Gemma is 32, hi, and she really wants a child. And her first marriage went horribly wrong many, many years ago. She's still not quite over that. Not heartbreak, but hurt. And she's also been told that she will have a difficult time conceiving naturally. So on the New Year's Eve party at her parents', she decides she is going to go through in vitro insemination and get pregnant in the coming year. And on the scene comes Josh, her older brother's best friend. Yeah, can you count the tropes? And much to her surprise, he says, sure, you can have my semen. And then it's about their relationship. She joins a self-help group for women trying to conceive, sort of with like hormonal help, medical help. And I thought those aspects were interesting. I did think it was all a bit too happy-clappy, to be honest. I mean, yes, you would expect that from a romance novel. But just from my own experience and people in my sort of extended circle of friends, yeah, I mean, yes, they touch upon how trying that whole experience can be, but I thought you can't give everyone a resolution. So that bugged me a little. The one thing that I just thought was hilarious is that Gemma works for a sort of self-proclaimed self-help guru. And my last job was in a relationship coaching company, and there were so many parallels and so much, it was so spot on and not even exaggerated for a laugh that much. So that was hilarious. And I thought that was just like a clever insight as well. She works as a social media manager, and I thought that was just like very apt for a certain demographic that I certainly belong to. And I thought it was really fun. I also gave this one 3 stars just because I thought it was like the storyline was really bumpy at times, and I thought she did do a lot of things that I wanted. Also completely predictable, like every little detail I predicted. So that was a bit of a shame. But interesting, different sort of romance novel for me, not something I would usually go for. Next, I also, via NetGalley, read a non-fiction book called Self-Publish and Succeed by Julie Broad, which is a non-fiction book about how you can self-publish a non-fiction book and actually have it sell. And I ended up only giving this sort of slightly disappointed 2 stars, even though I, to be quite fair, can't fault her for what I was missing, because the title says it all and delivers. There was a really, really high emphasis on the selling, marketing, self-branding aspect. And the focus was very strong on non-fiction books that, well, talk about something that you do professionally. For example, I think she came from like real estate and turned like that into books and like investing money. And her main point is that you should focus on not only making money from selling your book, but you can maximize your profit by having more street credibility if you've published a book. And you should focus on including things in this book that people will then want you to talk about and book you for conferences, talks, seminars, want to interview you, that sort of stuff. And while I thought that was an interesting spin, it was just a bit too cold and calculating, to be honest. I naively think your main aim when writing a book should be the content and what you want to talk about. And yes, I am not such a grand romantic that I don't think it warrants thinking about the money you want to make for a lot of work you've put in. But I still think the stronger the content, the stronger those little aspects you may want to change to be more marketable can also be. So I thought that was a strange way of looking at it. I am, again, used to that approach from my previous work. If you want to optimize text for websites and you have all these keywords you want to include so people find it, and quite often I think that is a development. On the whole, oh god, it's getting deep. On the whole, I think this is a development that frustrates me as someone who is very academically minded and wants the content to be on the forefront. I think we should think more about how that content is then more easily accessible, and people will find it and discuss it, rather than have our content be led by what someone will Google, because so many people will Google how many liters are in 6 ounces, but do we need to write books about that? I don't know. So 2 stars for that one, even though she delivers on what you expect from the book. Next, I read a book that I am still not completely decided on. For now, The Mermaid of Black Conch gets 3 stars from Monique Ruffey. This one is set on a Caribbean island, I believe, and a fisherman rescues a mermaid. And it is very much told like a fable or fairy tale, and she does some really interesting things with her language. There's some dialect in here, in the sort of journal entries of our main protagonist. There are also almost sort of lyrics in there that I'm guessing are from the mermaid, because she sings beautifully, but she has lost most of her ability to speak, because she supposedly is some ancient being who hasn't spoken for many, maybe millennia, we're not sure. And I just had really, really, really high hopes for this. I thought this was going to be like a really clever, magical read. And again, there were some scenes in this that I just found like really, really hurtful and shocking. And there were just like some really bad people in this. And yeah, sorry, I'm distracted because I'm sort of reading the last few pages, and that sort of didn't stick in my mind, really. So I am apparently not capable of forming eloquent thought about this book. I do think if you have a special interest in linguistic style of telling a story, then this could be really interesting for you. It felt very different to a lot of other fantasy out there. I've read the odd fantasy book that sort of has sort of mermaids or merpeople in it, and really often it's quite sad. I actually last week watched The Shape of Water with my boyfriend as well, which was also just really like gut-wrenching. So yeah, I guess as a fairy tale creature, merpeople always have a sense of sentimentality around them, and I wasn't really feeling it. It is quite interesting, however, that my edition has a blurb or recommendation by Bernardine Evaristo, who we will come back to because she's blurbed another book that I read this month. She didn't blurb Cultish by Amanda Mantell that I listened to as an audiobook and ended up giving 4-star to it. I really enjoyed this one. She talks about the language and its importance in forming cults. And I thought the interesting thing about this book was that she doesn't only talk about religious cults. She does include them. There's a whole part about Scientology, for instance, which I found myself drifting off whilst listening to a little bit, because most of what she writes there you just know. But I really enjoyed the wider scope because she also talks about CrossFit and Mary Kay, and on the whole, in a wider scope, it turns into almost a criticism of like modern capitalism and how malleable or manipulatable we are because we all want to belong to a cult. And while the content may not always be harmful, like yes, she does talk about sort of suicide cults, which obviously are the best example for identifying with a cult being very, very harmful. But she also talks about CrossFit, for instance, which you could argue the largest potential harm is accidents while working out or straining your muscles, or well, you could also seriously hurt yourself, but that's true for a lot of sport. But having done CrossFit myself, or having someone in my extended family who is like a sales rep for Mary Kay, I thought it was really interesting to have a quite like critical lens on just this sort of group behavior of us humans. I really liked the audiobook. I thought the parts that it was divided into were a little bit confusing. I think I wouldn't have struggled with that if I'd read the physical book, but in the audiobook I thought it was a little bit confusing. She sort of has parts where she talks about a sort of more broader topic, but then she has chapters within that, and that wasn't always completely clear for me how that was divided up. But on the whole, I actually really enjoyed this one. Next, I read a short little book which was blurbed by Bernardine Evaristo, and I loved it. This is my only 5-star read of the month, Assembly by Natasha Brown. The copy that I read, I had from my mum's bookshelves, and I think it came in at just over 100 pages. It could have been much longer and I would have enjoyed it. It needn't have been longer, however. Natasha Brown talks about a woman who feels very much like she's talking about herself, but who knows, living in London, and she has these really like powerful vignette style chapters where she talks about her desire but pressure on as well to climb the career ladder, and there are these really painful moments of everyday sexism and racism that she experiences, and I just thought everything about this was great. There were so many really like great quotes in this book, and there were a lot of scenes that I could relate to, even though I do not have this experience of being sort of the victim of racism, and I'm very privileged there. So I thought that was actually a real strength, that she was able to write about it without me feeling like like I was an outsider reading these topics, because there were aspects that I could relate to, and at the same time it really made me feel my privilege as well. So I thought that was just a great effect for me, very personally, reading this book. And I believe this was her debut, so I'm going to be really curious for what she publishes after this. And then the final book I read, I interestingly found that I feel a bit guilty almost talking about publicly. I buddy read this with my friend Anna. We both sort of said we felt almost a bit icky posting this. Have I hyped this up now? We buddy read and reread the very first Harry Potter novel together. We both have read these. I read all of these once as a child and teenager. So for me, this is the first time rereading them. And I listened to the entirety of the Pottermore podcast, I believe it's called, last year. So she has the plot quite fresh in her mind. So we did try paying attention to how this has aged, whether we could see aspects of the real and true criticism that J.K. Rowling has been subjected to over the last few years. I also looked out whether there were any sort of redeeming passages in here towards that criticism. Didn't find those. But despite all the criticism, and despite this having aged not very well as a children's book, I felt so much nostalgia reading this book, which was really fun. I read, I believe, the first 3 books in the Harry Potter series together with my dad, and we took turns reading it out to us. This was published when I was 8 years old, but I think I read it when I was 9 years old. And we took turns reading the chapters out loud to each other, which was just really, really fun. And as a child, also a really fun way of reading a story together, because I've always loved how my dad reads stories. He does voices and all the drama. It's great. But it was also a really, it sounds a bit dramatic, but like a really empowering thing to do as a young reader, to be reading something to an adult and them listening to you and them wanting to know how the story progresses. I just like 100% recommend you do this with a child that is able to read, but may not be that old yet. Although, to be honest, I'm 32 now, and when I read something out loud to people and they like listening to me, I still feel good. So that was a really fun thing to do. And then I will be rereading all of the books. This one I got off a secondhand online bookshop in Germany. The other 6 I still own. Don't know where my first one got lost. So I'm intrigued how that's going to go. I know the storyline, of course, but I've forgotten details. And I've watched all the movies, so I'm also expecting to see some differences between the movie and the book when I'm rereading it. I'm not really sure whether or how to give this a star rating. I do think the books got better, more thrilling as they went on. For all the nostalgia, I just give this all the stars, but just sort of as a story, I think it's probably more like a 3-star book, because it's a pretty middle of the road kids magical boarding school story. So those were the 7 books I read in January. Let me know how your reading month was. I have 3 buddy reads lined up for February, so I'm gonna have to see what else I squeeze in there. Let me know as well what your thoughts are on the divide between science fiction and fantasy, and if you have really good ways of determining which one's which. That would interest me. Other than that, I'm going to go out into the grey weather now. I hope you have a really good day, and I'll see you soon. Bye.